The year was 1954, and deep within a guarded hangar in Burbank, California, a small team of Lockheed engineers stared at blueprints that would change the course of the Cold War. What they were about to create wasn't just an aircraft. It was a machine designed to fly higher than any plane before it, to photograph Soviet military installations from altitudes the enemy couldn't reach, and to do it all while keeping secrets that would remain hidden for decades. This is the story of the U-2 spy plane, and the brilliant minds who built an impossible dream while the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war. If you're fascinated by Cold War history and engineering marvels, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories like this one. Kelly Johnson sat in his cramped office at Lockheed's Advanced Development Projects facility, known to insiders as the Skunk Works. Outside, the California sun beat down on the tarmac, but inside, the air conditioning hummed as Johnson reviewed intelligence reports that had crossed his desk that morning. The reports were troubling. The Soviet Union was expanding its military capabilities at an alarming rate, building bombers, developing missiles, and constructing facilities across its vast territory. The problem was simple but terrifying. America was flying blind. Traditional reconnaissance aircraft couldn't penetrate Soviet airspace without being shot down, and satellite technology was still years away from reality. Johnson was a legend in aviation circles, a man who had already designed some of the most advanced aircraft of World War II. But this challenge was different. The Central Intelligence Agency needed an aircraft that could fly at 70,000 feet, well above the range of Soviet fighters and surface-to-air missiles. It needed to carry high-resolution cameras capable of photographing details from 14 miles up. And perhaps most impossibly, it needed to be designed, built, and ready to fly within 8 months. Most engineers would have called it impossible. Johnson called it Tuesday. He assembled a team of 35 engineers and told them they were about to attempt something that violated every conventional rule of aircraft design. They would work in total secrecy, with minimal bureaucracy, and they would answer to almost no one. The Pentagon's usual procurement process took years. Johnson promised the CIA he would deliver in months. The first challenge was weight. To reach 70,000 feet, the aircraft needed to be extraordinarily light. Johnson's team began stripping away everything that wasn't absolutely essential. They used aluminum so thin you could dent it with your thumb. They designed a fuselage that was essentially a fuel tank with wings attached. The landing gear was so fragile that it had to be jettisoned after takeoff, with the plane landing on skids like a glider. Every rivet, every panel, every component was scrutinized for weight savings. Ben Rich, one of Johnson's key engineers, spent sleepless nights calculating fuel consumption rates. The U-2 needed to fly missions lasting more than 9 hours, covering thousands of miles deep into Soviet territory. This meant carrying an enormous amount of fuel, which meant more weight, which meant the plane needed even larger wings to generate lift at extreme altitudes. It was an engineering paradox that seemed to have no solution. The breakthrough came when the team realized they could design wings unlike anything that had ever flown before. The U-2's wings would span over 80 feet, longer than the entire fuselage. They would be incredibly thin and flexible, built to generate maximum lift in the thin air at 70,000 feet. During low-altitude operations, these wings would flex so much that the tips could rise and fall by as much as 6 feet. Pilots would later describe flying the U-2 as like balancing on the head of a pin while riding a bicycle. As winter turned to spring in 1955, the first prototype began to take shape in the Skunk Works hangar. Security was obsessive. Workers were forbidden from discussing their jobs with anyone, including family members. Documents were stored in safes, and every piece of scrap metal was accounted for and destroyed. The CIA understood that if the Soviets learned about the U-2's capabilities before it became operational, they would have time to develop countermeasures. Dick Boehm, a structural engineer on the team, remembers the day they rolled out the first completed aircraft. It looked like nothing else in the sky. The long, slender fuselage seemed too delicate to be real. The massive wings appeared ready to snap in a strong wind. The single jet engine, mounted in the rear, seemed inadequate for the task ahead. But when Johnson looked at it, he saw perfection. He saw an aircraft that weighed less than a Cadillac, but could fly higher than Mount Everest. The test flights began in the Nevada desert, at a remote location that would later become famous as Area 51. The first pilot to fly the U-2 was Tony Levier, a veteran test pilot who had flown everything Lockheed produced. Even he was nervous as he climbed into the cramped cockpit for the first time. The instrument panel was sparse, the seat uncomfortable, and the view from the canopy reminded him of sitting in a greenhouse. But when Levier advanced the throttle and felt the aircraft leap into the air after a ground roll of just 500 feet, he knew they had created something extraordinary. Flying the U-2 required a completely new approach to piloting. At 70,000 feet, the margin between stalling and overspeeding was sometimes less than 10 knots. Pilots called this the coffin corner, a regime where the slightest miscalculation could send the aircraft tumbling from the sky. The plane was so sensitive to weight distribution, the pilots had to carefully manage fuel consumption to maintain balance. If the fuel tanks weren't properly managed, the aircraft could become unflyable. The environmental challenges were equally daunting. At 70,000 feet, the air pressure is so low that human blood boils at body temperature. Pilots wore full pressure suits, similar to what astronauts would later use. The cockpit wasn't pressurized enough to sustain life at operational altitude. If the pressure suit failed, the pilot would have approximately 15 seconds of useful consciousness before passing out. There was no ejection seat in early models. If something went wrong at altitude, survival was unlikely. But the biggest secret wasn't the aircraft itself. It was what the U-2 could see. The camera system developed for the aircraft was revolutionary. Using a combination of multiple cameras with overlapping fields of view, the U-2 could photograph a strip of terrain 200 miles wide and 2,500 miles long on a single mission. The resolution was astonishing. From 14 miles up, the cameras could identify individual vehicles, read license plates, and distinguish between different types of military hardware. Dr. Edwin Land, the inventor of Polaroid instant photography, led the camera development effort. He understood that the limiting factor wasn't the aircraft's ability to get high enough, but the camera's ability to see clearly through miles of atmosphere. Land's team developed new film emulsions, precision optics, and stabilization systems that compensated for the aircraft's motion. The cameras were so advanced that they remained classified for decades after the U-2 program became public knowledge. By July of 1956, the U-2 was ready for operational missions. The first target was the Soviet Union itself. President Eisenhower personally authorized the overflights, understanding that he was taking an enormous political risk. If a U-2 was shot down over Soviet territory, it could trigger an international crisis or even war. But Eisenhower also understood that the intelligence gap was too dangerous to ignore. America needed to know what the Soviets were building, where they were building it, and how many weapons they possessed. The first operational mission launched from Wiesbaden, West Germany on a hot July morning. The pilot, whose name remained classified for decades, flew a route that took him over Moscow, Leningrad, and several suspected missile sites. Soviet radar operators watched in frustration as the mysterious aircraft appeared on their screens at altitudes their fighters couldn't reach. They scrambled interceptors, but the MiG-19s topped out at 55,000 feet, 15,000 feet below the U-2. The Soviets could see the intruder, but they were powerless to stop it. The photographs from that first mission were revelatory. American intelligence analysts could see Soviet bomber bases, nuclear facilities, and military installations with clarity that had previously been impossible. The images confirmed some suspicions and overturned others. Most importantly, they showed that the bomber gap that had caused such concern in Washington was largely fictional. The Soviets had fewer long-range bombers than feared, though they were rapidly developing ballistic missile technology. For 4 years, the U-2 operated with relative impunity. Lockheed engineers continuously refined the design, increasing its operational ceiling and improving its systems. Pilots flew missions over the Soviet Union, China, and other denied areas, collecting intelligence that shaped American foreign policy and military planning. But in Moscow, Soviet engineers were working furiously to develop a weapon that could reach the U-2's altitude. The solution came in the form of the SA-2 surface-to-air missile, a weapon that could reach altitudes above 80,000 feet. The Soviets deployed these missiles around key targets, and they waited. American intelligence knew about the SA-2, but they believed the U-2 was still flying too high to be threatened. This assessment would prove tragically wrong. On May 1, 1960, Francis Gary Powers took off from Peshawar, Pakistan, on a mission that would change everything. His route would take him across the Soviet Union to Norway, photographing missile sites and military installations along the way. Powers was an experienced U-2 pilot, a former Air Force fighter pilot who had been recruited by the CIA. He had flown this route several times before without incident. As Powers approached the city of Sverdlovsk, now called Yekaterinburg, Soviet air defense forces tracked his progress. Unlike previous missions, this time they had positioned SA-2 batteries along his route. When Powers was directly overhead, they launched a salvo of missiles. The first missile detonated close enough to the U-2 to damage the aircraft severely. Powers struggled to maintain control as the plane began to break apart. He managed to escape the disintegrating aircraft, but was captured immediately after landing by parachute. The shoot-down of Powers' U-2 triggered exactly the international crisis Eisenhower had feared. Initially, the American government claimed Powers had been on a weather research mission and had strayed off course due to oxygen system failure. But the Soviets had recovered not only Powers, but also the largely intact wreckage of the aircraft and its camera systems. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev gleefully displayed the evidence, exposing the American lie and humiliating Eisenhower on the world stage. Powers was put on trial in Moscow, paraded before cameras, and sentenced to prison. But even in this disaster, Lockheed's engineering provided one final secret. Before his capture, Powers had time to activate the aircraft's self-destruct mechanism, which was supposed to destroy the sensitive camera equipment. The mechanism malfunctioned, but its very existence revealed another layer of the secrecy surrounding the U-2 program. The aircraft had been designed from the beginning with the assumption that one might eventually be lost over enemy territory. Back in Burbank, Kelly Johnson and his team absorbed the news with grim determination. The U-2 program wasn't over, it was evolving. While overflights of the Soviet Union were suspended, the aircraft continued flying reconnaissance missions around the world. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, U-2 flights over Cuba provided the photographic evidence that Soviet missiles were being deployed just 90 miles from American shores. These images were crucial in allowing President Kennedy to navigate the crisis without nuclear war. The engineers at Lockheed continued improving the U-2 throughout the 1960s and beyond. They developed more powerful engines, better sensors, and enhanced electronic warfare systems. The aircraft that had been designed as a temporary solution pending satellite development proved so valuable that it remained in service decade after decade. Each generation of pilots learned to master the coffin corner, to manage the delicate fuel systems, and to operate in an environment where any mistake could be fatal. What made the U-2 program remarkable wasn't just the technical achievement, though that was extraordinary. It was the culture of innovation and secrecy that Kelly Johnson created at the Skunk Works. The team operated with minimal oversight, maximum autonomy, and an obsessive focus on solving impossible problems. They worked 80-hour weeks not because they were forced to, but because they believed in the mission. They kept secrets from their families, their friends, and the world because they understood the stakes. The human cost of this secrecy was significant. Marriages strained under the weight of classified work that couldn't be discussed. Children grew up not knowing what their fathers did for a living. Pilots faced extraordinary risks every time they climbed into the cockpit, knowing that if something went wrong at 70,000 feet, rescue was impossible. Several pilots died in training accidents, their contributions to national security remaining classified for decades. But the intelligence gathered by the U-2 helped prevent World War III. The photographs from over the Soviet Union allowed American leaders to make informed decisions based on facts rather than fear. They revealed when the Soviets were bluffing and when they were genuinely building up military capabilities. This knowledge helped calibrate the American response, avoiding both dangerous complacency and catastrophic overreaction. The story of what Lockheed hid from the Soviets goes beyond the aircraft's technical specifications. It encompasses the entire ecosystem of innovation that surrounded the U-2 program. The special fuel formulations that allowed the jet engine to operate efficiently at extreme altitudes, the pressure suits that kept pilots alive in an environment more hostile than the surface of Mars, the navigation systems that allowed pilots to find their way across thousands of miles without radio contact, the film processing techniques that could extract maximum detail from images taken through miles of hazy atmosphere. Even the maintenance procedures were classified. Ground crews developed specialized techniques for handling the delicate aircraft. They learned how to service engines that operated under conditions no manufacturer had anticipated. They created tools and procedures for working with materials and systems that existed nowhere else in aviation. This knowledge was carefully guarded, documented in classified manuals, and shared only among cleared personnel. As the Cold War progressed, the U-2 became a symbol of American technological superiority. But it also represented the moral complexity of intelligence gathering. The aircraft violated Soviet airspace routinely, an act that in peacetime would normally be considered an act of war. The pilots risked not just their lives, but international stability every time they crossed into denied territory. The program operated in a legal and ethical gray zone, justified by the belief that the intelligence gathered was essential to preventing nuclear conflict. Francis Gary Powers was eventually exchanged for a Soviet spy in 1962. He returned to America not as a hero, but under a cloud of controversy. Some criticized him for not destroying the aircraft completely, for allowing himself to be captured alive, for cooperating with Soviet interrogators. But pilots who knew the reality of the U-2 understood that Powers had done everything possible in an impossible situation. He had survived when survival itself was remarkable. The legacy of the U-2 program extends far beyond the aircraft itself. The management techniques pioneered by Kelly Johnson at the Skunk Works became a model for innovation across industries. The concept of small, autonomous teams working on challenging projects with minimal bureaucracy influenced everything from Silicon Valley startups to Pentagon special programs. The culture of excellence and secrecy that Johnson created continues to this day in classified programs around the world. Today, more than 70 years after Kelly Johnson first sketched the design on a drafting table, the U-2 remains in active service with the United States Air Force. It has been updated countless times with modern sensors, digital systems, and improved engines. But the basic design, that impossible combination of enormous wings and delicate structure, remains largely unchanged. The aircraft that was supposed to be a stopgap measure pending satellite development has outlasted the satellites that were meant to replace it. The engineers who designed the U-2 are mostly gone now, taking with them memories of long nights in the Burbank hangar, of impossible problems solved through brilliance and determination, of secrets kept for decades. But their achievement remains visible every time a U-2 climbs into the stratosphere, its pilot balanced on the coffin corner, its sensors peering down at a world that has changed dramatically since 1955, but still holds secrets worth discovering. What Lockheed hid from the Soviets wasn't just an aircraft. It was proof that American engineering could achieve the impossible when brilliant minds were given the freedom to innovate, the resources to experiment, and the trust to maintain operational security. The U-2 program showed that a small team of dedicated individuals could change the course of history, could help prevent nuclear war, could keep their country safe through innovation rather than aggression. The photographs taken by U-2s over 6 decades have documented the rise and fall of the Soviet Union, the proliferation of nuclear weapons, the evolution of military technology, and countless other developments that shaped our modern world. Those images helped policymakers understand threats, verify treaties, and make decisions that affected billions of lives. And all of it began with Kelly Johnson's refusal to accept that 70,000 feet was impossible to reach. The story of the U-2 is ultimately a story about human ingenuity confronting seemingly insurmountable challenges. It's about engineers who believed they could build an aircraft that defied conventional wisdom. It's about pilots who flew missions knowing each flight could be their last. It's about photographers and film developers and intelligence analysts who turned images into understanding. It's about the men and women who kept secrets because they understood that some knowledge was too valuable, too dangerous to share. In the depths of the Cold War, when nuclear annihilation seemed possible at any moment, the U-2 spy plane gave American leaders the gift of knowledge. It allowed them to see beyond the Iron Curtain, to understand what the Soviet Union was truly capable of, and to calibrate their responses accordingly. This wasn't just about military advantage. It was about survival. It was about making informed decisions in an environment where ignorance could trigger global catastrophe. The engineers at Lockheed understood this responsibility. They knew that their work wasn't just about building a better airplane. They were creating a tool that could prevent war, that could save millions of lives, that could help navigate humanity through its most dangerous period. This sense of purpose drove them through the impossible deadlines, the technical challenges, and the burden of secrecy that they carried for decades. What remains hidden even today are the full details of how the U-2's systems worked, how its cameras achieved such remarkable resolution, how its pilots navigated across hostile territory without electronic aids that could be detected. Some of this information has been declassified over the years, released in carefully edited documents that revealed just enough to satisfy historical curiosity while protecting techniques that remain relevant. But much remains classified, protected by the same culture of secrecy that Kelly Johnson instilled in his team 70 years ago. The pilots who flew the U-2 were a unique breed of aviators. They weren't just skilled flyers. They were men willing to sit alone in a cramped cockpit for 10 hours at a time, breathing recycled oxygen through a pressure suit, unable to move more than a few inches in any direction. The physical demands were extraordinary. Before each mission, pilots spent hours breathing pure oxygen to purge nitrogen from their bloodstream, preventing decompression sickness at altitude. The pre-flight meal was carefully controlled, low in fiber to minimize digestive issues during the long flights, when using the cockpit's primitive relief facilities was nearly impossible. During the mission itself, pilots fought constant fatigue. The thin air at 70,000 feet meant less oxygen reached the brain, even with the pressure suit and supplemental oxygen. Mental acuity decreased gradually over the course of a mission. Pilots had to constantly monitor their instruments, adjust fuel distribution, navigate using celestial references, and watch for any sign of hostile activity below, all while managing the aircraft's tendency to approach the coffin corner as fuel burned off and the plane became lighter. The isolation was profound. Radio silence was mandatory over hostile territory. Speaking could give away the aircraft's position to Soviet direction-finding equipment. So pilots flew in absolute silence, alone with their thoughts, 14 miles above a landscape that wanted them dead. If something went wrong, if the engine failed or the pressurization system malfunctioned, there was no one to help. No wingman flying alongside, no air traffic controller to guide them to safety. Just the vast emptiness of the stratosphere and the unforgiving physics of flight at the edge of space. Training for U-2 operations took months. Pilots learned to fly the aircraft first, mastering the delicate balance required at high altitude. Then came navigation training, learning to find their way across thousands of miles using only a sextant and the stars. They studied the targets they would photograph, memorizing the locations of military bases, missile sites, and industrial facilities. They learned evasion techniques in case they were shot down and captured. And they learned to keep secrets, to compartmentalize their knowledge, to live double lives where even their families couldn't know the full truth of what they did. The psychological screening was rigorous. The CIA needed pilots who could handle extreme stress, prolonged isolation, and the knowledge that capture meant years in a Soviet prison or worse. They needed men who could make split-second decisions at altitude while oxygen-deprived and exhausted. And they needed individuals who would never break under interrogation, who would protect classified information even under extreme duress. Not every skilled pilot had the mental fortitude for this work. Back at Lockheed, the engineering challenges continued long after the first U-2 took flight. As the Soviets improved their air defenses, Johnson's team worked to stay ahead. They developed electronic countermeasures to confuse radar systems. They experimented with radar-absorbing materials to reduce the aircraft's signature. They designed new camera systems with even higher resolution, capable of detecting details that earlier versions would have missed. One of the most significant upgrades came in the form of improved engines. The original Pratt and Whitney J57 engine was powerful but inefficient at extreme altitudes. Johnson's team worked with engine manufacturers to develop new variants that could operate more efficiently in the thin air above 70,000 feet. Each improvement in engine performance translated directly into operational capability. A more efficient engine meant longer range, higher altitude, or both. It meant the ability to photograph targets deeper inside Soviet territory, to spend more time over hostile airspace, to gather more intelligence per mission. The fuel itself was specially formulated for the U-2's unique requirements. Standard jet fuel would freeze solid at the temperatures encountered at 70,000 feet, where outside air temperatures could drop to minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit or colder. Lockheed worked with petroleum companies to develop a low-volatility fuel that remained liquid even in extreme cold. This fuel had other special properties, too. It was less likely to form vapor bubbles in the fuel lines. It had precise density characteristics that allowed for accurate fuel quantity measurements, and it contained additives that prevented corrosion in the aircraft's fuel system. The ground support equipment required for U-2 operations was equally specialized. The aircraft couldn't taxi normally because its tandem landing gear configuration made it unstable on the ground. During takeoff roll, the wings were supported by small wheels called pogos that dropped away as the aircraft became airborne. After landing, ground crew had to sprint alongside the slowing aircraft, grabbing the wingtips to prevent them from dragging on the runway as the plane settled onto its main gear and tail skid. Maintenance was a continuous challenge. The aircraft's delicate construction meant that even minor damage could compromise structural integrity. Mechanics developed specialized repair techniques for the thin aluminum skin. They learned to work with materials and tolerances that had never been used in aircraft construction before. A single dented panel that might be acceptable on a conventional aircraft could be dangerous on the U-2, potentially affecting the aerodynamics at high altitude or creating stress points that could lead to structural failure. The camera systems required their own specialized maintenance. The optics had to be kept absolutely clean and perfectly aligned. Even microscopic particles of dust on a lens could degrade image quality. The film magazines had to be loaded in complete darkness to prevent exposure. The mechanisms that advanced the film and controlled the shutters had to operate flawlessly in the extreme cold and vibration of high-altitude flight. Technicians spent hours calibrating and testing each camera system before it was certified for operational use. Intelligence analysts who processed the U-2 imagery developed their own expertise. They learned to identify Soviet military equipment from unique angles and perspectives. They could distinguish between different types of aircraft, missiles, and vehicles, based on subtle details visible in the photographs. They tracked construction projects, watching as missile sites and military bases took shape over multiple overflights. They compared images taken weeks or months apart, identifying changes that revealed Soviet intentions and capabilities. The photographic interpreters worked in secure facilities, examining the images through specialized magnifying equipment. They annotated each frame, marking items of interest, and creating detailed reports for intelligence consumers. Their work required incredible attention to detail. A small detail noticed in one photograph could provide crucial context for understanding a larger pattern. A vehicle parked in an unusual location might indicate activity at a nearby facility. The shadow cast by a structure could reveal its height and purpose. This intelligence flowed up through channels to the highest levels of government. Presidents Eisenhower and Kennedy relied on U-2 imagery to understand Soviet capabilities and intentions. The photographs provided concrete evidence that could be used in policy discussions and negotiations. When diplomats met with Soviet counterparts, American officials knew the truth about what the Soviets were building and where. This knowledge proved invaluable during arms control negotiations and crisis management. The Cuban Missile Crisis demonstrated the U-2's value most dramatically. In October 1962, when Soviet ships were delivering missiles to Cuba, U-2 flights provided the photographic proof that forced the crisis into the open. The images showed missile sites under construction with characteristic patterns that photo interpreters recognized immediately. President Kennedy was able to confront the Soviets with undeniable evidence of their activities, making it impossible for them to deny what they were doing. During the tense days that followed, U-2 flights continued monitoring the situation in Cuba. Each mission provided updated information about the status of the missile sites, the arrival of additional equipment, and the level of readiness of Soviet forces. This intelligence allowed Kennedy and his advisors to track exactly what was happening on the ground, to verify Soviet claims, and to make informed decisions about how to respond. The stakes could not have been higher. The world stood on the brink of nuclear war, and accurate intelligence was essential to navigating the crisis without catastrophe. Tragically, a U-2 was shot down over Cuba during the crisis, killing pilot Major Rudolf Anderson. His death came at the most dangerous moment of the standoff, when both sides were preparing for possible military action. Anderson's loss reminded everyone involved of the human cost of intelligence gathering and the risks that pilots took every time they flew into hostile territory. But even in death, Anderson's mission provided valuable intelligence about the improving capability of Soviet air defenses in Cuba. The U-2 program expanded beyond the Soviet Union and Cuba. Aircraft deployed to bases around the world, flying missions over China, North Vietnam, and other areas of interest. Each deployment brought new challenges. Different climates affected aircraft performance. Different air defense systems required different tactics. Local political sensitivities influenced mission planning. But wherever the U-2 flew, it provided intelligence that couldn't be obtained any other way. In Asia, U-2s monitored China's nuclear weapons program, photographing test sites and production facilities. The intelligence gathered helped American leaders understand the pace of Chinese nuclear development and the types of weapons being produced. This knowledge influenced decisions about arms control, defense spending, and diplomatic engagement with China. Similar missions flew over North Vietnam, providing targeting information for military operations and bomb damage assessment after airstrikes. The technological evolution of the U-2 continued through the 1970s and 80s. New variants incorporated advanced sensors beyond just cameras. Signals intelligence equipment allowed the aircraft to intercept and record enemy radar and communications. Infrared sensors could detect heat signatures from missile launches or industrial facilities. Each new capability expanded the intelligence the U-2 could collect and the value it provided to decision makers. By the 1980s, some analysts predicted the U-2 would finally be retired. Satellite reconnaissance had matured significantly, providing coverage of denied territories without risking pilots or aircraft. But the U-2 offered flexibility that satellites couldn't match. It could be redirected mid-mission to investigate unexpected developments. It could loiter over a target area for extended periods, something satellites couldn't do. And it could carry new sensors into service much faster than building and launching a new satellite. The end of the Cold War brought new missions for the U-2, drug interdiction along the southern border of the United States, environmental monitoring, disaster assessment, counterterrorism operations. The aircraft's ability to fly long missions at high altitude with advanced sensors proved valuable in ways its original designers never imagined. The same cameras that once photographed Soviet missile sites now tracked drug smugglers and monitored forest fires. Through all these changes, the basic design remained recognizable. The long wings, the delicate fuselage, the distinctive engine configuration. Modern U-2s incorporate digital flight controls, satellite communications, and sensors that would seem like science fiction to the engineers who built the first prototype. But they still face the same fundamental challenges. The coffin corner still demands perfect piloting. The pressure suit still protects pilots from the hostile environment at 70,000 feet. The aircraft still requires specialized ground support and meticulous maintenance. The pilots who fly today's U-2s are the inheritors of a tradition stretching back to Tony Livier's first test flight in 1955. They train at the same base, following procedures refined over decades of operations. They learn the same difficult skills of high-altitude flight, accepting the same risks that their predecessors faced. And they maintain the same culture of secrecy and professionalism that Kelly Johnson instilled in the original Skunk Works team. What makes the U-2's longevity remarkable is not just its continued operational service, but the fact that no replacement has proven superior for all its missions. The Air Force has attempted multiple times to develop successor aircraft. Programs have been initiated, prototypes built, billions spent. But each time, the analysis has concluded that the U-2 still offers capabilities that new designs can't match at acceptable cost. The unique combination of altitude, endurance, sensor capacity, and operational flexibility remains difficult to replicate. The human stories behind the U-2 program are as compelling as the technical achievements. There were the families who spent years not knowing where their loved ones were deployed or what missions they flew, the wives who raised children alone while their husbands disappeared for weeks at a time on classified assignments, the children who grew up with fathers who couldn't answer simple questions about their work. The emotional toll of this secrecy affected thousands of people who supported the program in various ways. There were moments of triumph and tragedy. Pilots who completed missions that provided crucial intelligence at critical moments, engineers who solved problems that seemed unsolvable, working through the night to meet impossible deadlines, ground crews who kept aircraft flying under difficult conditions, often with improvised solutions when proper parts weren't available, and there were losses. Pilots who didn't return from missions, crashes during training, families who received visits from somber officers bearing terrible news. The development of the pressure suit deserves special mention as one of the hidden engineering marvels of the U-2 program. Early attempts to protect pilots at extreme altitude used modified suits from other programs, but none proved adequate for the unique demands of U-2 operations. Engineers had to create a suit that could maintain pressure for 10 hours or more, allow enough mobility for the pilot to operate complex controls, interface with the aircraft's oxygen and communication systems, and protect against temperatures that could swing from scorching heat on the ground to extreme cold at altitude. The final pressure suit design incorporated dozens of innovations. Multiple layers of specialized fabrics provided insulation and pressure containment. A complex system of zippers and seals allowed pilots to don the suit while maintaining its integrity. The helmet included a visor that could be adjusted for different light conditions, and a communication system that worked reliably despite the noise and vibration of high-altitude flight. Even the gloves were engineering masterpieces, providing enough dexterity to manipulate switches and controls while maintaining pressure and thermal protection. Pilots had to learn to function in these suits despite significant limitations. The pressurized environment made every movement more difficult. Simple tasks like adjusting a switch or reading an instrument required extra effort. The suit's bulk meant pilots had to carefully plan their movements to avoid accidentally bumping controls or interfering with flight operations. And the psychological challenge of being completely enclosed in a pressurized cocoon for hours on end required mental discipline that was almost as demanding as the physical piloting skills. The navigation systems used by early U-2 pilots represented another hidden technical achievement. Without GPS or modern inertial navigation systems, pilots had to find their way across thousands of miles using techniques that would have been familiar to World War II bomber crews. They used celestial navigation, taking sightings on stars through a periscope sextant. They relied on dead reckoning, carefully tracking speed, heading, and time to estimate their position. And they used the few electronic navigation aids available, though these were unreliable over Soviet territory and could reveal the aircraft's presence to enemy direction-finding equipment. The accuracy required was extraordinary. A navigation error of just a few miles could mean missing a target entirely or photographing the wrong facility. Intelligence analysts needed to know exactly where each photograph was taken to correctly identify and catalog the installations shown. So pilots spent hours in training, practicing navigation techniques, until they could determine their position within a mile or two, even after flying for thousands of miles without external references. Weather added another layer of complexity to U-2 operations. At 70,000 feet, pilots flew above most weather, but they still had to contend with high-altitude phenomena that could endanger the aircraft. Clear air turbulence could strike without warning, subjecting the delicate airframe to stresses it was never designed to handle. Ice crystals in the thin atmosphere could damage the sensitive camera optics. And the jet stream, with winds sometimes exceeding 200 miles per hour, could blow the aircraft far off course if not properly accounted for in flight planning. Ground-based weather forecasting for U-2 operations required special expertise. Meteorologists had to predict conditions at altitudes where conventional weather data was scarce or non-existent. They studied high-altitude wind patterns, tracked storm systems that could affect flight routes, and tried to forecast the location and intensity of clear air turbulence. Their accuracy often meant the difference between mission success and failure, or even between safe return and disaster. The intelligence value of U-2 operations extended far beyond the photographs themselves. The very act of flying over Soviet territory provided information about enemy air defenses. When Soviet radar operators tracked the U-2, American intelligence could analyze their responses, learning about radar locations, capabilities, and procedures. When Soviet fighters scrambled to intercept, observers could study their tactics and performance. Even failed interception attempts revealed useful intelligence about the limitations of Soviet air defense systems. This electronic intelligence gathering became increasingly sophisticated over time. Special equipment installed on later U-2 variants could record and analyze enemy radar signals, building a comprehensive picture of Soviet air defense capabilities. This information proved invaluable not just for intelligence analysts, but for military planners who needed to understand how American bombers might penetrate Soviet airspace in the event of war. The U-2 essentially mapped the Soviet air defense network, identifying gaps and weaknesses that could be exploited. The political dimension of U-2 operations added yet another layer of complexity to the program. Every overflight required presidential authorization, reflecting the serious diplomatic and military risks involved. Presidents had to weigh the intelligence value against the possibility of a shoot-down that could trigger an international crisis. They had to consider the timing of flights in relation to ongoing diplomatic negotiations. And they had to balance the short-term intelligence gains against the long-term risk of revealing American capabilities to the Soviets. This political calculus became even more complicated after Powers was shot down in 1960. The incident proved that the U-2 was vulnerable, that Soviet air defenses were improving, and that overflights carried real risks of public embarrassment and diplomatic damage. President Eisenhower suspended overflights of the Soviet Union, though missions continued over other denied areas where the political risks were judged to be lower. Future presidents would have to carefully consider whether the intelligence gained from any particular mission justified the potential costs. The U-2 program also influenced the development of satellite reconnaissance. The success of the aircraft in gathering photographic intelligence demonstrated the value of overhead imagery and helped justify the enormous investment required to develop satellite systems. Many of the camera technologies pioneered for the U-2 were adapted for use in early reconnaissance satellites. The photo interpreters trained on U-2 imagery became the core cadre who would analyze satellite photographs. In a sense, the U-2 program paved the way for the space-based reconnaissance capabilities that would eventually supplement and partially replace it. But satellites couldn't entirely replace the U-2, as events would repeatedly demonstrate. During regional crises and conflicts, the ability to task a U-2 to fly over a specific area on short notice proved invaluable. Satellites followed predictable orbits that enemy forces could learn to evade. The U-2 could adjust its route mid-mission or return repeatedly to monitor rapidly changing situations. This flexibility, combined with the aircraft's ability to carry the latest sensor technology without the delays inherent in satellite development, ensured the U-2 remained relevant long after satellites became operational. The story of the U-2 spy plane stands as a testament to what can be achieved when innovation is unleashed from bureaucratic constraints, when talented individuals are trusted with important missions, and when the stakes are high enough to demand excellence. It reminds us that sometimes the most important achievements happen in secret, that the heroes who change history often do so without recognition, and that the price of peace sometimes includes knowledge that can never be fully shared. What Lockheed hid from the Soviets was more than just technical specifications. It was the proof that freedom, innovation, and determination could overcome any obstacle, could reach any altitude, and could help guide humanity through its darkest hours toward a safer future.